Hello? Yes, yes. Okay. We are streaming to Facebook, YouTube, and to Twitter right now at the same time. It's magic. Hello, everyone. My name is Michaela. Thank you so much for joining us. Is it anyone's first time at Sankofa? Well, welcome. All right, so Sankofa, just very briefly, Sankofa was founded in 1997 by filmmaking couple Hailey and Shirikiana Garima. You might know the film Sankofa. It's available for streaming right now on Netflix. Yeah, no, yeah, okay. Check it out. Thank you. We are a bookstore that focuses on people of African descent, so we call ourselves like a Pan-African paradise. And we're just so happy to feature books, that deal with social issues that are relevant today. Today, we are so happy to be presenting Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win, which tells the fascinating true story of an individual radical organizer turned independent Chicago City Council member. And speaking on the book, it's not only the author, Helen Shiller, am I saying it here? Thank you. We also have Clarence Page, who was born in Dayton, Ohio. I won't say the year. I don't know how you feel about that.
Everybody knows now.
During his senior year of high school, Page served as the feature editor at the school's biweekly newspaper. In 1965, he won his first award from the Southeast Ohio High School Newspaper Association for the year's best feature article. It was at this point that Page, under the guidance of Mrs. Mary Kendall, his high school newspaper instructor, became very interested in journalism. He graduated from Middleton High School in 1965, and that summer he earned his first pay as a journalist by selling freelance photos and stories to the Middleton Journal and Cincinnati Enquirer. In 1969, he received his B.S. degree in journalism from Ohio University, where he worked on the student newspaper while at college. And right now, where did it go? I'm sorry.
It's okay, take your time. Everybody's got an iPhone now. So.
Thank you.
It's like trigger a telephone. Right
Wait, where am I? Okay, I cut it off there for some reason. I'm so sorry. But
I'm sure the audience won't be.
Okay. Let me keep it moving. I don't want to hold this up too long. Let me go to Ms. Shiller.
So Clarence is actually a reporter at the Chicago. Has
Thank
been for
you.
a long time. Nationally syndicated with the Chicago Tribune. But
I'm a columnist now, though.
Yeah,
We want to keep those separate.
so,
I'm allowed to give my opinion right up front. So big difference.
Congratulations. Okay, Helen Shiller went from radical anti-war activist in Wisconsin to a member of a collective of white allies of the Black Panther Party in Chicago to an elected city council person who helped break the back of the racialized opposition to Harold Washington, Chicago's first Black mayor. Shiller participated when few others did in the historic fight against the gentrification of a unique, economically and racially mixed Chicago community on the North Side. With insight into historic community organizing and political battles in Chicago from the 1970s through 2010, this book details numerous policy fights and conflicts in Chicago during this time, illuminating current political themes and battles that remain relevant to this day. Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win is a compelling, insightful must-read for all those struggling for a better world today, which we are. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Mr. Page, who will start the Q&A.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. Good job. I really am humbled by these occasions where I get introduced by somebody. That's really and did a very good job of it, too. Funny thing about life, Helen, is, after a certain point, your friends start writing books that are like autobiographies, and they give a little snatch of the life that you recall over those years. This is what happens. I was thinking when I read your book, because so many of the events in it, I was there, or I was close to it, or I was observing it. I knew some people. Well, I've been writing about it, that's right. And I was always very much impressed by it. Let me just roll back to when, back to the time when we met. You had left Madison, Wisconsin, and came to Chicago. And
through Racine.
Through Racine, I'll let Racine know that, yeah, that's right. But, well, I'll let you tell everybody why you became, well, I have to say that you were not new to activism. You were what a lot of people describe as a red diaper baby, right? Your parents were progressive activists.
Yeah.
If progressive is the right term to use for what was going on at that time. And so you, I remember one line in the book where you mentioned your father didn't think you were active enough in the anti-war movement, unlike so many of our parents.
Yeah.
So to take it from there, what brought you to Chicago?
So I was in college in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, and my dad was, after my first year, disturbed that I wasn't more involved in the anti-war movement. So he encouraged me to get involved. And I proceeded to go back to school and find, at that point, things were just sort of getting going. There were struggles that students were having with the administration about various issues. But there was a committee to end the war in Vietnam, and they were fundraising by doing plays. And the play, so I went, they were getting ready to do a play on, called The Hostage, which was a play written by Brendan Behan. And for me, it was a play about moral dilemmas. And what it talked about, it was really about the struggle of the Irish for independence. And so I went and saw this was happening, and I used to make all my own clothes. So I said, oh, I can do this. I can do the costumes. So I got involved really through that channel. And by the time I left, was very involved in the Dow demonstration, which was the first time we actually sat in. And then later in the Black Student Strike for Black Studies and various other things. So I had planned to become a master weaver. I had done weaving when I was in high school and during my summers, and I was planning on going, had decided, but one either to Mexico or to Sweden. And so I had studied a little bit both of Swedish and Spanish, neither of which I conquered, and was really planning on doing that when I left. But things changed that year. And by the end of the year, I was joining a couple of people who were in Racine, Wisconsin organizing. And was there for a couple of years.
I asked what the cause was at that time.
It was the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we were organizing. Initially, the among my friends, it was a group of men, guys, because they were organizing against the draft, and they actually burned their draft cards as a statement, which then led to the formation of the Draft Resistance Union. And they were related to the Students for a Democratic Society, but they were really focused on doing organizing. So they had gone out in the summer to different communities around Wisconsin to organize people against the war and explain why it was that we were concerned about the war. And some of them ended up staying in 3 different cities to organize. One was Milwaukee, one was Waukegan, Illinois, and the other was Racine, Wisconsin. And so that's how that was the setup. So there were people there, and they recruited me to go there. And so most of the folks that were doing this organizing were focused on factory organizing. So I was there. I connected with Mark Zalkin, who then became, we ultimately got married, and he became my son's father. We had a son. And he and I both started working in factories that summer. Mark worked in a foundry that was, moving around 50 to 100 pound pieces that were going to go into cars, and in over 100 degree temperature, which we believe was what triggered what he ultimately had, which was multiple sclerosis. So, which just became part of the story too. At any rate, we decided after this summer that that wasn't what we wanted to do, and that we really wanted to work among youth. So we started to do that. And one of the things that we did, which brought us to Chicago initially, was just on several trips and to connect with people there, was when Fred Hampton was holding rallies at the Federal Plaza in Chicago, demonstrating against the treatment of Bobby Seale in the Chicago 8 trial, we brought students, we went to the high school, the two high schools, and literally brought students from the school to us. We recruited them to come in the car with us. We crossed state lines. I can't believe we did this. And went to the rally. And or we did it a few times. It was in September, I remember, of 1969. And at any rate, so we really got into working with youth and therefore their families. And we started to, around that time, we connected with people in Milwaukee who were trying to establish a chapter of the Black Panther Party, but who were getting papers and selling them. And we would get papers from them and we would then sell them and set up our own distribution in Racine. And then we started to do various different programs like the Free Breakfast Program and other stuff. And then Fred Hampton was killed. And around the time that he was killed, I mean, I go into this in the detail in the book, but essentially, or more detail, but essentially, we were actually considering that we were going to leave at that time. And when Fred died, we kind of recommitted ourselves to go back to Racine. We ended up connecting with the Rockford chapter, Rockford, Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. One of their leadership, we worked with two people there. Predominantly, and one of them had been in, Harold Bell had been in the apartment when Fred was killed. And the two of them, Ray Lewis and Harold Bell, would come to Racine about once a month and do political education with us, but we got the papers from them regularly. And ultimately, after being there for about 2.5 years, there was a group that we were recruited, along with people from St. Louis, to come to Chicago to form the Intercommunal Survival Committee, which was a cadre of white people working under the direction of the Black Panther Party. So Slim Coleman came to recruit us. But apparently, according to George Atkins, Susan, you can tell me it was a different story, but George told me that Bobby Rush came down to recruit him then. And so he describes this conversation he had where he says that, he said, okay, Bobby says, you should really come. We need you to be working in the white community, blah, blah, blah. And George says to him, because, we thought the revolution was around the block. So George said to him, well, how long it's going to be? And Bobby said, 2 years. So he said, I can do that. And they all came to Chicago. So there was so there were five of you, four of you? Susan, Kim, George, James.
George, me, James.
Yeah. Came up to Chicago at the same time or during the course of the next few months. And I came initially with one other person from Racine, but then this was in the summer, by the next year, by January, we had about 20 people there. Mostly the rest were from Racine at that point. So anyway, that was the transition and how I got to Chicago.
Yes, we're rushing through a lot of events and people because of it's not easy to put a lot of time.
So let me say one thing. The book starts with a story about my father sitting me down in front of, since you mentioned my dad, in front of a TV. This is in 1953 or 4. I can't remember. It's in the book, right? It's the Army, it's a McCarthy hearing, it's the HUAC hearings, House on Un-American Activities. It's the hearings that, when McCarthy charged that the Army was full of communists and they, had to, whatever. And it was really probably what led to his downfall. But he has me stay home from kindergarten. He sits me in front of the TV and he says, I want you to watch this. I wasn't unhappy about being home, and I liked being in the room where it was. In our house, the heat came through the floor, so I was very comfortable. And so I'm watching this thing, and he said, I know you're not going to probably remember this, but I want you to remember I did this. I made you come here, and the reason is I want you to remember you always have to fight fascism, and it will be here. It will be here in your lifetime. So I said, okay, whatever. But when I turned 18, around the time that, or maybe like half a year before he harangued me, the movie Point of Order came out, which was a movie of the McCarthy hearing, those hearings. And so I actually went and saw it. And when I was writing the book and I went back and read it, what really was striking was the language and the conversation and the things that McCarthy was saying was it could have come out of Trump's mouth. It was using almost the same words. but certainly the same kind of attitude. So that was just kept me going because it reassured me that I really had to get this book done.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's kind of close to what we were in for. Well, what do you think of at that time, you went from McCarthy hearings to the time you were 18, and
Oh, I will one more thing, I'm sorry, because this is actually in between. My parents my father had a run-in with the FBI, which then ended up in a heart attack, and my mother literally getting rid of all of her books. But one book that survived, that I was the first chapter book that I ever read, in between these two events, was Freedom Road by Howard Fest. And it's a book about Reconstruction, but it's really written like, it's written for use, I think, or maybe that's how I always wrote. But it was the first chapter book I read, and it really did imprint on me a sense of fury about that I never quite forgot. But that was really impactful. That was probably probably more impactful even than sitting home and watching the hearings about that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. What was it like when you first encountered Fred Hampton and the movement that he was generating there in Chicago? What do you recall from that experience?
Well, the first time was that Fred came to Madison, Wisconsin to speak when I was a student. And that was the first time that I had seen him. And that was just, he had a huge amount of charisma and he made a lot of sense. So that was very impactful. It's really, he always said, I don't think I ever heard him speak when he didn't say, dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't dare to struggle, you don't deserve to win, which is really where obviously the title of the book comes from. And then obviously I saw him again when we crossed state lines with teenagers to the rallies. And then later on, before I came to Chicago to live, I came a few times to work on different programs that our predecessor to the Intercommunal Survival Committee, which was the People's Information Center, programs that they were doing. And I came twice, and during that time, one of those times was before Fred was killed. So it was shortly after their office on the west side had been bombed out by the police, and so it was a brief conversation. And, this was someone who really was very serious, but very impactful.
Indeed. I have to ask you, you saw the Fred Hampton movie,
Yes.
I presume. Now, what'd you think of it?
Well, there was a lot of criticism of it, especially from members of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, because it gave largely anyone that was around Chicago who I know who saw the movie reacted the same way, which was there was too much humanizing of O'Neill.
Oh, right.
So O'Neill was the man who was the FBI informant who received $300 after providing the FBI with the layout of the apartment that Fred lived in. But he was as significantly the head of security, and in the part he was like security. He was assigned to security, and he was, I think, in charge of it, and kept coming up with really outlandish ideas, all of which Fred shot down. But he was still there, and so there were so many things about it. But having said that, when the movie came out, there were so many people that were not there then who were now energized to find out about the Black Panther Party. And I can't tell you how many conversations I was asked to be part of, Zoom meetings and others, so that people could hear about Fred. And they would find, like Tara Stamps, Marion Stamps' daughter,
Right.
who set up a Zoom meeting with about 50 people, and half of them knew Fred, and almost none of them did I know. So they knew him in different ways. They had grown up with him. They had new family members. He had such a large reach. Even at, he died at 21. So he had a remarkable reach. And there were folks that were my contemporaries who, did many, many things over the years, but really have been impacted by him. And so the conversations were very enlightening to the folks that were younger or were participating and wanted to understand what that was all about, what the Black Panther Party was all about. So that part of it I thought was really positive.
Yeah, I had the same experience. My son was like born in '89, and
Yeah.
he really picked up his first real visual idea of what it was like back then. I was racing down
Yeah.
memory lane, just seeing all those. They shot a lot of this on the
Oh
west
my
side.
God, the visuals were
Yes.
great.
Yeah, so I was back there. But I was when Fred Hampton died. I found out about it while I was lying on my bunk at Fort Dix, New Jersey, because your efforts to save me from the draft didn't quite succeed. And it was.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I appreciate your effort. I got back in the end in one piece, and I sure as hell learned a lot. But there was number. We were all about the same age about that time. You know, the draft hung over us. Like it was just a spirit in the air. And when you look back upon that time, well, first of all, where were you when you heard the Fred had been shot?
I had just returned from Thanksgiving. We had just returned from Thanksgiving. We were in New York, and we woke that night before, and we actually were in Milwaukee not racing because all these people that had gone off to organize were actually meeting to evaluate what each of us was doing. And we had started and then stopped for Thanksgiving, and we'd come back, and so we woke up in the morning and heard he was dead. And we literally the night before decided that we were going to split up and we weren't going to leave. And by the end of the day, we were committed to go back to racing and whatever. I mean, this is, I guess, history. But I was.
The rest is in the book.
The rest
The rest
is in the
book.
book.
Very good.
I
That's her granddaughter here mentioning that, by the way. Excellent to have your promo people in the family.
Took some convincing. But I wanted to say that for those that don't know it, which you probably all do actually, but just in case, there were no women in the military. I mean, I suppose that people keep saying they were, whatever, but no, but women weren't being drafted.
Oh, no,
So
not been
it was
drafted.
really,
And I will say at my, there at Fort Dix, I'd say about 1,000 fellows in my battalion, and there was about half a dozen women.
Yeah.
So
So
anyway.
what did they do?
I'm sorry?
And what did the women do?
They were WACs, Women's Army
Right,
Corps.
I know, but what did they do?
Oh, it was secretarial work
Yeah,
mostly.
exactly.
That's sort of
So the big conversation all those years and years after was, before they actually, the women in combat, was how could women ever be in combat? So when I think about that, it changes.
Yeah, when they were finally able to get into combat, they performed very heroic service. But anyway, I want to say, I don't want to get lost on memory lane, but I can't hardly help it. But when with the period of really the decline of the Panthers, but there was a lot of activism, I recall. I mean, you mentioned Slim Coleman. He was part of the Rainbow Coalition too, because you had the Young Patriots going on up in Uptown. You had the Latin Kings. You had various.
Okay, so the Rainbow Coalition was Fred Hampton's vision.
Right, before
And-
Jesse Jackson, by the way.
Right, well, he died before,
Yeah, that's right.
So there were, Fred was focused on organizing, the Black Panther Party was never a gang. But Fred was focused in part in organizing the leaders of the large gangs in Chicago to move towards serve the people programs and to serve the people, to serve the people instead of exploiting people. And the FBI was crazy about that. When we didn't have access to a lot of their files, but I did have access to the 98 of the 103 or 4 that the judge allowed used in the civil trial that the Hampton family and the survivors of the raid that killed Fred and Mark Clark had. He agreed to let them use a small number of them, and I had access to the majority of them. And when I went through them a few years ago, The FBI, there would be a memo from the head of the FBI or someone, some senior agent saying, this is what we want you to do. We want you to destroy the Black Panther Party, we're trying to prevent the rise of the Black Messiah, all that stuff was in there. They'd say, we want you to come up with ideas, and then we can get the ideas and we'll tell you whether you can do it or not. And one of the ideas that was approved and constantly focused on was to disrupt any relationship between Fred and any of those gang leaders. There were three different gangs. And so I followed it through, and literally 3 days after, or 4 days after he was killed that same week, there's a memo that says, you can forget all that. We've taken care of it. So having said that, Fred was very focused on that. And he met Chacha Jimenez, I think, in jail, and they talked, and Chacha Jimenez was the head of the Young Lords organization.
I said Latin Kings, that was
Yeah,
a mistake, that was
right.
a gang. Young Lords
Right,
was the-
and the Young Lords had been a gang, and before he met Fred, they had turned it into a political organization. And they were fighting urban renewal, which they also called urban removal. And they'd been forced out of one community, the Puerto Rican community, the Puerto Rican community had been, and now they were being forced out of Lincoln Park, another one. And so they were fighting back on that, and they were treated similarly by the FBI. And meanwhile, Fred had, the SDS had been involved started a few years earlier in 65, and the party was established in November of 68 in Illinois. And the Young Lords around the same time had sort of transitioned into a political organization, and all of them were doing free clinics and daycare and breakfast programs and health centers. And in Uptown, Bobby Lee was a field I can't remember the name, like a field captain for the Black Panther Party, and Fred assigned him to work on the north side, go to Uptown, and work with these guys that SDS had been working with under the banner of JOIN, Jobs or Income Now. And they had taken whatever the SDS had done early on. A gang there had called Goodfellows, I believe, had transformed themselves into the Young Patriots. And they were also doing political work, and they were all white, and they were mostly from Appalachia, but not entirely. And they had a relationship, some of them, like one of the sons one of them was the son of Terry, what's her name? Peggy Terry. And Peggy Terry had been Eldridge Cleaver's vice president when he ran on the Freedom, whatever ticket, and he ran for president. So there were all these connections. And Bobby Lee, there's a movie, I'm not sure there's several movies, Revolutionary, whatever, and then The Murder for Him. I'm not sure which one it is. They were all made by local filmmakers. But in one of them, there's actually a clip of Bobby Lee talking to a group of these white guys, mostly white guys, but not entirely, about what they had in common. And so that was, but they all received huge repression. And I get into some of this in the book, and some of the things that connect everybody. But by the time we didn't come to Chicago until 1972. And I think in part, the leadership of the party then, because it was after Fred had been killed a few years, wanted to basically continue to have a rainbow coalition, but a lot of the players, everyone was underground, except for the party, Black Panther Party, and us. So I think that was part of us doing this in Chicago, and also being able to have white people being organized to join the Black-led struggle for liberation in Chicago. So so in many ways, we were the continuation of the Rainbow Coalition, and the folks that are still around or come back into the picture from the Young Patriots treat us that way, as always they do to me when I talk to them. In 1972, Chacha came back to Chicago, from being underground, dealt with his legal issues, and then ran for alderman in the ward that we were in. So that was
the Uptown Ward.
Yeah, because it was the northern end of Lakeview and about 2/3 of Uptown, more southern part. And he was, and at that point, that part of Lakeview was like 75% Puerto Rican.
You probably were on the other side of town. The Bobby Rush ran for alderman. to down the
The
second ward.
first he ran for state rep in 1974,
Oh, okay, I forgot that.
and
Okay.
we actually helped him on that campaign, as I recall.
Okay, because, and by then, the chapter had dissolved, as I recall.
Well, yes and no. So Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown ran for mayor and city council of Oakland respectively, in that order. And then there was a runoff and there were some other elections. So that process started in 72. In 1973 in Chicago, there was a year of, starting actually in August, as we were coming into Chicago, they had the first rally against to end police brutality and establish community control. We had one in October, and then there was a citywide one that the party did in June. And there was an ordinance that was written for community control police, for citizen oversight.
Right.
And they were working on it, and we were going that summer into citywide, in multiple communities, into an organizing effort for community control to get it on the ballot. But around the same time, everybody in all the chapters in the country were called back to Oakland for to create Oakland as a base of operations. So a lot of people, Bobby, I don't think went or did, he came back quickly. I mean, he was back by 74. But a few people came back in 1975 and reestablished a chapter in Chicago. And they functioned until around 77. But they functioned in Oakland until 1980.
Well, we're getting toward the era when Harold Washington's profile began to rise up there in Chicago. And a lot of history was happening, so some of us remember, but between, but we went from Mayor Daley, his honor, Richard J., to Jane Byrne. I can't forget Bolandic, yes, right there between Jane Byrne and, between Daley and Jane Byrne, there was the Jane Byrne campaign, which was a big upset at that time, and then she got a lot of the same supporters who would later be Harold Washington supporters, but this was after Jane disappointed us by not being the reformer that many people had hoped, and then next thing you knew, you had Harold came along. When did you know Harold Washington? What were your first impressions of him?
Well, the first time I heard about him was in 1972 when he and Richard Newhouse, who was also a state representative, and Harold was a state representative then, penned a letter objecting to the way in which the survivors of the raid against Red Hampton were being treated legally. And I actually have a copy of that letter. And then in 1977, when Harold ran for, so what happened was Daley died in December 1976, and there was a special election. And Harold Washington ran, won 5 wards, all black wards. But we organized the 46th ward for him. I can't tell you how many votes there were because I think they probably weren't worth counting. But we worked really hard, and we also took in other parts of the north side because we had a magazine at the time, and it was called Keep Strong, and we covered people's day-to-day struggles to survive, not just in Uptown, but literally all over the city. And the concept when we first started, we really were kind of following the 10-point platform and program and the way in which people were struggling around each of those issues. So it brought us into many communities, and we had a lot of contacts on the north side. So especially in West Town and Humboldt Park, not so much farther north of there. So we also brought Harold, we just took him all over the place on the north side. So he got to know people. But that was the election that Bolandic won. Bolandic had been the alderman representing the ward that that Daley was from. He was his guy. So Bolandic,
which was the most powerful ward politically in Chicago.
Yeah, for many years.
Read Mike White was boss.
So Bolandic blew it because we had a huge snowstorm, and he kept telling people that there were parking lots available for them to park in and whatever. And then at one point he had the trains, the subway, our L system, was routed so that it went from downtown Chicago to the western suburbs and did not stop where anyone lived, who was Chicago.
And the south suburbs.
And the south, so it was
Always
both
no loop
ways.
to 95th Street,
Yeah.
with no stops.
That's
Yeah,
right.
and people sitting on platforms
Right.
freezing, and
Exactly.
the trains just going.
So on the south and the west side, which is both cases were the heart of the Black community.
Right.
So, so anyway, everybody called Jane Byrne the Snow Queen, and that's really in large measure. And she claimed she was going to do all these reforms. And for about 6 months, she actually did a few things. And there's like a whole part of the book that really talks about what she did and what she didn't do, and then what she did do. And especially with regards to housing and public housing, to education in the school system, and to the police. And the creation of the first contract, which intentionally excluded the African American Patrolmen's League and really cut them off at the knees as representative of African American policemen. And they essentially did the same to the other sort of so-called ethnic groups, including Latino ones, but it was really the one that was really was the most impactful was the way in which the African American Patrolmen's League was impacted, and all of those things I actually go into detail in the book.
Yeah, part of
I
it.
couldn't help myself because
I
that's
don't know
it.
how to handle modern electronics, so my phone flashlight came on, and I can't turn it off. But anyway.
You don't care. You don't.
I had a quick question.
But anyway, the reason for that is because that sets the tone for understanding the election of Harold Washington and why there were people all over the city, why it was such an, and why he was so perfect for that moment.
Yes, the thing I was going to mention was that we were talking about the L trains passing people up. The folks have to understand how powerless Black folks felt in Chicago and resentful about it. And everything kind of became encapsulated. That one morning there, when our toes were freezing, waiting for the train, Dick Ciccone, you may recall, was a political editor at that time. But when the votes came in, that shocked everybody by voting Blandick out and Jane Byrne in, he ordered up a ward-by-ward breakdown by precincts and constructed a map of where Jane Byrne's votes came from. And a large percentage of them, huge percentage, came right along those two L lines that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So it's like it became very obvious that when folks got mad enough, they'd come out and they had power, and they exerted power. And even the great Chicago machine was overthrown. I just had to throw that in there.
Well, but then the other thing which we forgot, we glossed over, was that after Fred Hampton was killed, the raid was organized through the state's attorney. And all of it's a county spot, but all the county offices were controlled by the Democratic machine and had been for many years. And the next election for state's attorney, Hanrahan was defeated, and it was the first time, and it was shocking, that a Republican was elected for that position. And it was explicitly because of the murder of Fred Hampton.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's yeah, well, there's so much to reminisce about here. But we should mention that Fred Hampton's family filed suit, and it was rather a landmark event.
There was a civil suit filed by the families of Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, and the survivors of the raid. And it was a year and a half. I actually write about it. I had the responsibility of covering the trial and writing articles both for Keep Strong, but also for the Black Panther paper. So I went to Keep Strong only came out once a month, but the paper came out every week. So we had to write stories every week. And it was incredible to sit through all that. And at the very end, so the judge kept refusing to let anyone make even mention of these FBI files that we all suspected existed. And COINTELPRO was not known then. We just suspected there was actually something written and clearly instructions going on that were affecting the civil rights movement and in general and the Black Panther Party in particular. And he just kept cutting off the family's attorneys anytime that was raised until the head of the FBI in Chicago misspoke and made reference to one of these files. And the judge was so angry. He was on their side, but he was so angry that they had lied to him that he demanded that they bring all the files down. And so whenever it was, the next day, the next week, they came in literally with 2 shopping carts full of files, all the way to the top. And in the end, the judge sealed them all, they're still sealed, and only allowed for, I think, I had said 98, and Flynn Taylor, who's one of the attorneys, corrected me, so the right amount is in the book, but it's like something like 103. I just got hold of only 98. And, yeah, and it was still, and when I told him I had it and I was gonna write about it, he was like, I'm not sure you should do that. I said, well, I'm doing it. So I did it. But yeah, I think they're still sealed. They were a year ago.
And we should mention that the survivors won the.
Oh, so they won, and then it was, no, they won, no, they did the whole trial, and the judge, the judge, I think they won.
That's a different trial.
The judge then overturned whatever it was, and he took, he dismissed a bunch of the defendants. And who they are, yeah, it's all in there. And then they appealed it and won in the appeal. And it was ordered back to have another trial. And most of the defendants that the judge had taken out were reinstated by the appellate court. And ultimately, when Harold Washington became mayor, there was a settlement. And the details of that, I write about the details of that.
Yeah, finally got something like resembling justice there.
Well, it was so minimal. I mean, it was million something more, over $1 million, but a lot of it went to pay for all the, actual costs that were, yeah.
Right.
So currently, though, I think that it's either about to be or it has been, the house that Fred grew up in is being designated as a historic site, and there's a state effort to I forgot what they call it, but it's like a moving designation to designate throughout the state important sites like offices and in Chicago's places where they did a lot of their activities, to make them part of have historic designation and plaques, or if they're still there, to actually preserve them. Yeah.
Well, when and why did you decide to run for older person?
Okay, so in 1978, there was a special election in our ward, and we needed someone to run, and I was, it wasn't my idea, and it was not my idea, and.
Harold Washington didn't want to run either, I remember.
Well, this was earlier.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I was part of getting it, anyway.
I know.
So this was earlier, and he actually worked for me. He came out and campaigned for me because we had campaigned for him. And there were 3 elections because it was a special election in the spring. But then the next February was the regular elections, and then we were forced into runoff. So then there was a 3rd election. And I was ahead in the first election in February, and lost by under like about 200 votes. I can't remember exactly. In the spring, and the reason that I lost, well, there are a lot of reasons. Anyway, so I swore I'd never run again, and I hate politics. I didn't want to run the first place. I swore I'd never do it again. Harold.
You certainly didn't show it very much.
Harold got elected. We used to argue about this.
Yeah.
And Harold got elected because he loved politics. Harold got elected in 1983, and only after being really pushed by people all over the city, and he had a very long reach, very huge umbrella. And he said, I'll only even consider it if there's at least $50,000 raised and at least, what was it, or maybe $100,000 raised and 50,000 new registered voters.
That's right, yeah.
And so there was literally the 5 black millionaires in the city got together and formed a finance committee and raised the money right away. And then multiple numbers of people went into action for the voter registration. So Ed Gardner, who is the head of Sasheen, put together a campaign that was focused on October 5th, which is a 1 day of registration all over the city. And we had a coalition that had formed to oppose Chicago's master plan. Every city in the 70s had a master plan. and ours was called the Chicago 21 Plan. So we were in touch with organizations doing similar work all over the city, and we also have been distributing Black Panther papers to them all these years. And and then there were people just reacting to all the stuff that Byrne had done. And so there were people all over the city. Push was doing stuff every week. Harold he became a congressman in 1980 and had weekly political education classes, which, anywhere from 50 to 100 people came to every single weekend. And so there was stuff happening everywhere. And we were talking to some of the folks we were working with, and we done a lot of work with welfare, defense, and unemployment. And someone came and said, well, why don't we just go to those offices? And there have been a lot of people doing, challenging the way voter registration was, because at that point, it was very hard to get registered to vote. And so we actually, utilizing the organizing that these other folks had done, we somehow convinced the Board of Elections to come and have voter registrars at unemployment offices and welfare offices. So between these two efforts, by October, over 200,000 people had registered to vote. Now, Harold was running for re-election as a congressman in November, so he wasn't going to do anything until that was over. But clearly, citywide, we had met his demands. And I remember we had a print shop, and we started printing the petition. We printed a ton of petitions to get him on the ballot. People all over the city took them on the day of election that he was running for re-election, all over the city. And we collected probably enough petitions for him to actually file, or close to it, a really good start, by the end of that day. And about 6 or 7 days later, I think within a week, he announced he was running, and then everybody just went wild and finished getting stuff.
It was pretty wild. I think I can't help but remember the first debate between Harold Washington.
How was it?
It was Jane Byrne, Harold Washington,
And Rich Daley.
and Richard M. Daley, this the son of
Yes.
Del Boss.
Yeah.
And his when it came to Harold, was called on last of the three first words out of his mouth were to the effect of, "Ladies and gentlemen, Jane Byrne is ruining your city." That's the way he said it. The whole place kind of just stunned with the charisma and the strength that he exhibited. He controlled the evening after that. And the next day, you may recall, I call it campaign pin day, with these little blue Harold Washington for mayor campaign pins.
Yeah, the ones that I designed those.
You designed that? Okay, I believe it. We got somebody with a mover and shaker behind the scenes here, ladies and gentlemen. I just remember getting up the next day, taking the L, which is also what we call the subway too, and getting downtown, coming up in the loop, and looking around, everybody was wearing a blue pin.
You want to know something funny?
Yes.
That's inspiration for the color of the book.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it looked familiar. There you go.
Yeah.
It was that kind of an event, though. Everybody in town was involved, whether they wanted to or not.
Yeah. So the thing about those debates was that truly Harold was the only one on that stage who had a command of the issues.
Yes, that's right. Everybody else had slogans and whatever.
And your newspaper and the other newspapers just tore them apart. They didn't respect them, so you could see they couldn't.
Until they started to win.
They just couldn't deal with that.
Right.
And then there was the rally. So on the Martin Luther King's birthday, we had a huge rally, I think, and we filled up the pavilion at the University of Illinois, which held, with standing room only, held about 15,000 people, 10,000 technically. And it blew everyone's mind. I don't think so much of people there, they were just energized. But it showed that he had really broad support, and no one had a rally that large. We think now, we watch all the stuff, there's all these huge rallies. That hadn't happened before in Chicago. So I remember that was, I can't remember the order, I don't know if you remember, of the debates and that event.
Well, the first debate, I'm sorry, you mean the order.
It must have started as a.
Yeah, I think the debate came first.
Yeah.
There,
Well, they had a few, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I just remember the very first one. Everybody remembers that. That's the way it usually is. Like the Kennedy Nixon debate. debates.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody remembers the first one. Who remembers what happened after that?
Right.
But this is very, well, I, what, yeah, one more thing I wanted to ask in regards to, we were talking earlier about similarities between Harold Washington's rise and Barack Obama. What do you think of when you look back at how Barack Obama came on the scene, so to speak, and rose the way he did against odds that were formidable?
I think that, well, they were very different because Harold was older and more seasoned and had a very broad umbrella. And Barack started his political career with a lot less, well, he wasn't from Chicago, so he didn't have that same Chicago base. But he was,
Who was he from, Kenya?
No, he was
I'm
from
sorry.
Hawaii.
I'm sorry, I played that, Jen, but anyway. Those remember.
So, right. So their talents were expressed in different ways. And also, I think that their politics weren't identical by any means, but they both represented a new direction, and a different direction, and a hope. And so what I think is most similar between them is the way they were treated and by the respective power structures. And what we saw in Chicago was a precursor to the way Barack was treated, and then really to the way the Republican Party has embraced the right and really allowed such a severe polarization. Although, you know, the Democratic Party, it was the Democratic Party in Chicago, and those elements of the Democratic Party still exist well, so it's a little complicated.
Well, it's
But
a
you
little
have-
more complicated because Chicago is fundamentally a one-party town.
Yeah.
And in fact, later the aldermanic races became nonpartisan.
Right.
But what we did during that race was substitute parties for whose side are you on?
Yeah.
Are you part of the, are you a Jane Byrne voter or a Harold Washington voter?
Right.
And that was, well, those who later identified themselves as Republican, like Eddie Verdoliak, among others, were on the Jane Byrne side. So.
Yeah. Well, I think that, so you had in Chicago, Verdoliak and Burke, two aldermen, who then organized 29 aldermen in Harold's first term when he was first elected to oppose everything he did, which is not unlike what happened in Congress, especially after the Republicans, the Democrats lost the Senate.
Right.
And they basically said the same thing. We're just going to make sure he's a one-term president.
That's
They
right.
didn't succeed in that, but they did succeed in really interrupting the kinds of things that he was started to be able to do in the first term. I mean, in the first 2 years. So what happened in Chicago was that there had been a lawsuit filed against the remap based on the 1980 census, and the judge ordered early in 1986 that there be special elections. And as a result of those special elections, there was a 25-25 split now in the city council. And that's when Harold started working on me to run for alderman. And so in the end, I really was part of one of many people who was in his face about running for mayor. I have to acknowledge that. And we wrote a lot of stories about him, and I was always there taking pictures, and he was like, okay. Anyway, so I couldn't deny that I would be able to win. And the alderman of the 46th ward who preceded me and was part of the 29 had a chief of staff who was someone I had known because he was an intelligence informant. Wasn't QI, it wasn't the informant for the FBI, but it was an informant for one of the other U.S. intelligence agencies. He outed himself in 1972, but in 1968, I had gone on a trip to Cuba and he was on that trip. And so I knew him, and I knew him to be crazy. And all of a sudden, after Harold was elected in 1983, this guy is running around the 46th ward, literally stalking me, sitting outside my house. He becomes the chief of staff to the alderman, and he starts organizing the alderman who wears being Jewish on his sleeve, I have to say. And he starts organizing sort of the street gang type neighborhood gangs in Uptown into a group called the White Patriots.
Young Patriots?
No, it wasn't White something.
Mhm.
I can't remember. And arranging for political education classes for them with members of the Klan and members of the Nazi Party.
Wow.
And and there's a young man who's the son of someone we work with and who is a leader in the Black Lung Association in Chicago, who couldn't read, long story short. And he had, unbeknownst to him at the time, or at least he said, that there was a paper that they claimed he had signed with an X to join the Nazi Party. When he found that out, he said, I don't want that, I'm gonna quit. And they said, if you quit, we're gonna kill you. These are all teenagers.
Yeah.
And they did. A week later, he quit and they killed him a week later. So, and the guy who killed him, the kid who killed him then started threatening my son. So I had many reasons to be, so I was already upset with the guy and then, it got personal. So it wasn't like I was, so number one, Harold asked me to do this and I knew I could win. And number two, this was a guy who needed to be defeated for lots of reasons, not just the 29. So not just the opposition to Harold. So finally I agreed to run and did end up being his 26th vote, which meant he now had 40 votes, which he always told me would happen. He said, if I get the 26th vote, there's always people that are on the fence and they'll be with me and you'll give me what I need in order to be able to properly function and operate. And I did, and he did, and then he died.
Yeah.
7 months later. But so the story's there. But I think what's important at this point is that I had to decide whether or not I was going to stay in the city council. And Harold said something really important that I think often people don't understand. They don't understand the nuance of it. But he would say over and over again that his primary goal, overall goal, because there were a lot of very smaller things you had to do to accomplish this and also just to govern. But his objective was to eliminate in Chicago institutional racism and institutional corruption. And that was not a heady thing to do. I mean, that was something that would take time.
Yeah,
But it wasn't
those
that-
are modest goals there.
Yeah, but it would take time, not because it would take time, because things take a long time. This is the nuance. His point was it would only happen when people internalized those changes. So he was going to make those structural changes, but he knew that they wouldn't stick, they wouldn't last, and they wouldn't be carried out until there was an opportunity for people to actually internalize them, which would take a lot of work. And he was really committed to that. And it was a conversation we had often. So I know now, sometimes when I talk to people and I say something about 20 years, they interpret it just as if things take a long time. I don't want to hear about a long time. But that's why I say it's a nuance, because I think the point he made was really critical, which is that we in order to truly win over hearts and minds, to really change the things that need to be changed and they're so embedded in our culture, we need to not just change minds, but we need to internalize that change. And we need to do that individually, but we need to do it collectively as people. So I think that was really important, and that's why I stayed. Well, that and the fact that people were very stubborn, and there were a lot of talking heads who were saying, she just won on his coattails, she can't do it again, and I just got pissed off. So those two things.
By the way, I don't know if you know, Eddie Burke had his first day in court today.
I know.
Yes, one of those, what do we call him? Yeah, well, he was one of the leaders of the Verdoliak cabal and the anti-Washington
But he
faction.
always combined his political work, used his political work to benefit his private law practice.
There you go.
And Mark, my son's dad, who had MS and died in 1998, was always involved and was always writing. He was a really good writer. And throughout the 80s, he was also a really good organizer, and we were organizing all over the country. So he wasn't in Chicago until we pulled everybody back a good part of the time in the 70s. till he pulled everyone back to my first election. But then he started organizing in Canaryville and in Canaryville and Bridgeport, all those sort of white areas that are sort of stuck in between on the south side.
I used to call it Daily Land, with 3 generations of Chicago mayors coming this one here.
So he went on a campaign around people's gas and how much our gas was costing, and Burke took the ordinance, and he claimed that he was going to be the sponsor. And then he gutted it. At the same time, he was taking money in his law firm from People's Gas. And so Mark had written about this. And there were a few other examples of that. So this was in the 80s. Before Harold was elected, actually. And then he became a assistant press secretary for Harold, worked with Laura Washington. And then after Harold died, when Daley came into office, he fired him, but by then he was ready to go, pretty much. Although whatever. So he in the mid-90s had serious case of pneumonia and ended up in the ICU for about a month. And when he got out of the ICU, and at this point we were separated, and we would hang out maybe. We'd have lunch or dinner once a month. That's when we saw each other. So they put him into a regular room, and he's been trached. And we're really concerned because there's one nurse for 4 rooms, and we're not really pleased. So I'm in the room organizing all our friends. We're setting up a schedule, right? And he wakes up, and he looks at me, and he first says, "What are you doing here?" And then he says, "Is Burke in jail yet?" And so when he died, Burke presented, we had what we call the consent calendar, and for, like acknowledging when people died or their birthdays or special events, stuff that wasn't controversial. And Burke had written a resolution for Mark. And I'm thinking, and he comes up to me and says, "I have a resolution, do you mind if I introduce it?" And I'm like, oh my God, Mark would turn over in his grave, and his mom would really like this. So I told Burke I said, "I'm gonna tell you a story, and if you still wanna do it, go for it." And so I told him that story. He turned red in the face, because he always turned red in the face. He turned around and he introduced it, and then sent me a letter about how ironic the world is. But that was Burke.
Full of ironies, indeed.
Yeah.
It was Eddie Burke and Eddie Verdoliak,
Yeah.
2 of the leaders finally meeting Cook County's
Yeah.
version of justice.
Yeah.
And there was one other thing. Now Eddie Burke's most famous client is Donald Trump. Eddie Burke specializes in giving you a great deal on your property taxes. And so guess who?
He appeals them.
Yeah, guess who suggested to Trump he needed to talk to? Hire Eddie Burke.
And he did, and he saved him millions of dollars,
That's
which meant we didn't get those in taxes.
That's right. And they stuck it.
And tell me that's not a conflict of interest. You have a fiduciary responsibility as a member of the Chicago City Council who votes on our budget and was head of the Finance Committee, deciding, having a huge amount of impact into what taxes we were going to charge.
That's
And
right.
then he was representing, he only represented people for whom he could save literally significant amounts of money, all of which was then taken out of the tax base.
We call it the
That way.
Chicago way.
Oh my God. That was a state way too. A few
The
state people did the
state
same
too.
thing.
Yeah, well, who runs which, I'll often say. But I'm gonna, I know some of you folks got some questions or statements, and no long sermons, please, but I'd be very happy to entertain that now. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about the gendered politics in Chicago, what it was like to be a woman politician running in the 70s, and then of course as alderman in the 80s and onward. That was always something I thought about. Jane Byrne was a terrible mayor, but she also got treated differently because she was a woman. I'm just curious.
Well, I have to say that she was a terrible mayor, but she was also a racist. And I, along with Marion Sampson, Dorothy Tillman, we made a button that had a web on it. It was red, it had a web on it, and it was Women Embarrassed by Burn, and it was called Whip. And a lot of people gave me a hard time about that. So but so in answer to your question, it was not uncommon for me to occasionally get my butt pinched. I think that there was, by the regulars, I was treated with, I don't know how to say this, with lack of respect, but almost in a very diminutive way. And they developed a name for me. They called me Aldi, which stuck. And I kind of embraced Aldi,
Aldi.
sort of a diminutive phrase. And I decided I would embrace all of these things and show, just do my thing. But I was a little bit insecure, and I was, and I really, it wasn't my field. I wasn't a politician. And so the biggest thing for me was being able to, and they would always try and make me, anybody who was asking a question that they didn't want to hear, or who was coming from a position that wasn't a strict status quo position, they would cut you off or try and make you feel stupid or silly. So literally, because I went to every budget hearing, and for years I wasn't on the budget committee, but I figured I had to, especially after Daley was elected, that I had to follow the money, because it was the only way I was going to figure out how to get services into my ward, because the word out was don't do anything for Shiller. So I had a mantra. I absolutely went to every single hearing. They could not let me speak, but they would try and make me feel stupid. So my mantra was, any question, no question is a stupid question. No question is a stupid question. And I would just repeat that to myself over and over again and just get it out. And demand the people, and then, demand that they spoke in English, in real English, simple English, understandable English. They get up and try and say stuff and make it sound like, words that you had to be an expert to understand.
Like quasi-legalese.
Yeah, but it was about money, so whatever that would be.
Yeah.
And, so there were that. I assume that they would have treated some men the same way, but with a little bit less, well, maybe there wouldn't have been, I don't know, but that was my experience. And I really, and the things, but let me tell you. So there was, so I just sort of stuck to my thing. I do know that for people I worked with, if it was some of the men that I worked with who were the spokespersons for a lot of things, who would then try and negotiate stuff with some of the regulars. Always when that was going on, in the background were comments about, oh, it's really Shiller who's really behind with it. We can talk to them because she's really the one behind all this. So that was the dynamic. But at one point, early on Daley's, like in '89, I think when he was first elected, I managed somehow to get a subcommittee on domestic violence. I went on a campaign about respect for women. And I set up a subcommittee out of one of the regular committees on domestic violence. And I know aldermen participated, but I knew they weren't going to. So I invited every person that I knew, an organization I knew in the city that was doing domestic violence work, to be part of it. So we had a pretty large group of people, and I insisted that there be a sergeant assigned from the police department, so they sent me a woman. Because, that I liked that. But they just figured they'd just let Shiller just go off and do her thing. And so there was somebody who was working on putting together a program to create a safe space for women, for women who needed to bring their children to meet with the women's abuser as a result of a court order. And there weren't any safe places for that. So I had proposed that we fund this, and they were having none of it. And I went to all the budget hearings. They were 2 weeks long. And I would hardly slept during those 2 weeks because I was always preparing my questions the night before and never getting answers. So this is the last day. I'm exhausted. The last department to come up is the police department. Yeah. And so I've been having this argument all the way through. And we're talking to the police department, not about domestic violence, but I'm asking them a whole series of questions. The superintendent is there, and all of his command staff, all of whom were white and big guys. We're all around him and they're just talking. I can't even hear the superintendent. And I don't think he can hear me. And I'm not getting a very good interaction and I'm exhausted. And out of nowhere, I burst into tears.
Oh.
And I'm beside myself, and as are the only three other aldermen that are in the room. And no one knows what to do. And the chief of staff or the chairman of the committee slowly, I'm in the back of the city council, slowly walks all the way around, comes up, sits down next to me, kneels down, and says, "How does a couple $100,000 look for your program?" And I'm like, wow, is that how I get money?
No question.
That's how I got it funded. So, you know, it was a double-edged sword.
Wow.
I didn't cry again ever. I wasn't intentional, but it was a lesson.
That was, that was a red letter day there. As they say, you've been very kind. I want to let you sell some books here, so I don't want.
I want to say one more thing, because I think this is really important.
Yeah.
And I say it once or twice in the book, but I think this is really an important concept, especially in our times, that when people run or support someone for an office because they think they're going to be progressive, they think they're going to be able to do things that really need to be done, that oftentimes they're disappointed. And they're disappointed because those things don't happen. And for the people who are running for office, or someone like myself who really has things that they want to do, the same thing is true for us both, which is there needs to be a sea to swim in. The elected official has to accept that and embrace it, but the people who support them and have worked hard to get them elected need to continue to build that seat. It's not over when the election is over. And it's the most important lesson that I've learned. And it's actually a conversation that whenever I've had it with any elected official, their response to me is, yeah, I need that. So we both need to ask for it, but we also have to accept it. And I do have some examples of when someone might have asked me to do something, promised that they'd be there with support and weren't, and I got really creamed. At which point I realized that you can't, as an elected official, people think you can do more than you can. On the one hand, the elected official often thinks he can do less than he can, or she can do less than they can. I think we can do anything, it's just a matter of when. I think we can solve any problem, it's just a matter of figuring it out. It may take some time, but maybe we can figure it out right away, as long as we approach it from the point of view of identifying, and we want to identify real solutions, real problems, and real solutions to them, and that we're paying attention to the potential collateral impacts. And if we do that, it means identifying the most severe manifestation, looking at it from the perspective of who's most affected by that, and then identifying how to solve that so that it really solves it at that point, but also looking at the surrounding impacts, pulling it, kind of like a circle, like a ripple, when a stone hits the water, to see what the additional collateral impacts are and if we can live with them. If not, what do we have to do at the core to be able to do, what difference do we have to do or to add or subtract? That's hard work. It takes input from many people. It takes talking to people you agree with and you disagree with. Because even in the most serious disagreements, there's usually an ounce of truth, which you can learn from. And I think that's really hard. It's not what elected officials usually do because we're taught we just go for the sound bites. I mean, I know I'm not good at sound bites. So the reporters who liked me would like, Helen, please give me a sound bite. And I rarely could. But they would be so excited if I said one by mistake. But I think this is really important because we don't do that, and it so often isn't done. That's what leads to cynicism. It's okay to be skeptical, but if we're cynical, then we don't participate. And if we don't participate, we're not going to be able to force the change that we want. So I think that that's really important. It's the most important lesson I got from it, and I think that it's critical for each of us to know that if we're really going to change the world and accept that part of that is changing the power structure, then we're going to engage in it, then we can't just, it's not a one-off. We might want to take a break, but it's not a one-off, and we all have a responsibility. I think that's really important.
Thank you so much, Helen. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen Shiller. The book is Learn to Struggle, Young to Win. I recommend it. Feels like my life story. It's definitely yours.
So I met Clarence shortly after you came to Chicago, I think.
You sure did,
It
yeah.
was in the 70s.
Yeah, I actually, when I first came in this, that summer of '69, and then I got drafted in November, and right before Fred was killed, in fact, as I mentioned. And then 2 years later, I was back in Chicago again, so you might have, we might have met on the second go around, just depending.
I think I met you in the 70s for sure.
Yeah, there you go. Well, thank you again, thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate it.